Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar today, The Untested Rape Kit Crisis and Cold Case Sexual Assault Prosecutions with Kym Worthy, prosecutor from Wayne County, Michigan. I want to make a note here that this is a re-record of a previously delivered webinar due to technical issues that made the original recording unusable. I'm Ilsa Connect. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Policy from the National Center for Victims of Crime. I'm also the director of our DNA Resource Center. I want to just tell you a little bit about the National Center for Victims of Crime. We are a 25-year-old national resource and advocacy organization whose mission is to help victims of crime rebuild their lives. Our staff works on ensuring rights and resources for victims, and we provide training and technical assistance to those who work with survivors. We are glad to bring you this webinar today with the support of the Office on Violence Against Women at the United States Department of Justice. The webinar is part of our project that aims to help communities create an approach to the problem of untested sexual assault kits that takes survivors' rights, needs, and wishes into account. Under this grant, we have created an online resource collection that includes victims' rights laws, policies and protocols relating to victim notification, laws and pending legislation, and materials related to working with victims in untested sexual assault cases. A report from our Victim Roundtable held a few years ago is available also on our website. In that roundtable, we asked survivors about their experiences in cases with untested kits. And that document will provide a lot of information to how victims view notification and being re-engaged in the system after many, many years. We are providing technical assistance, for example, with creating a victim notification process and engaging victims in many communities, including Cleveland, Detroit, and Houston. And you can register for webinars and check out all of our information about untested kits at victimsofcrime.org/DNA. All of our webinars are archived online, and we have more than 30 webinars available there. This is my information. If you want to get in touch with me, you can also follow us on Twitter. Okay, on to our speaker today. I'm very excited to have this webinar as part of our series. Our speaker, Ms. Kym Worthy, is a firecracker. She is the first African-American and first woman to become the Wayne County Prosecutor. Most of you on the webinar probably have heard of Ms. Worthy's work on the untested rape kit problem in Detroit. If you read the news on rape kits, you can't miss it. She's a strong advocate for testing sexual assault kits and pursuing justice in these cases for victims and to hold rapists accountable. Ms. Worthy earned her law degree from the University of Notre Dame and her undergraduate degree in economics and political science from the University of Michigan. She is the mother of Anastasia, 16, and 4-year-old twin daughters, Alessandra and Aniston. It is my pleasure to hand over the controls to Kym Worthy.
I'm pleased to be here to present for the National Crime Victims Center. And as stated, I'm going to be talking about the untested kits. And we can begin by talking about, during this presentation, I'm going to be quoting some statistics quite often, and not too often actually to get on your nerves, but when it's appropriate. And on the first slide that you see here, we have listed for you our sources for our statistics. And so at any point you want to reference these sources for the data I'm going to quote, feel free. They're listed there for you. Obviously, anyone can be a victim of rape or sexual assault. And I just want to give this slight caveat before we start. In Michigan, our sexual assault statute is called criminal sexual conduct. So if you hear me slip and say CSC, that's what we call our rape statute. So rape, sexual assault, CSC, same thing, because that's what we call it here in Michigan. But of course, some people who are victims of rape or sexual assault are more at risk than others. Nearly 1 in 5 women has been raped in her lifetime. 1 in 71 men, or almost 1.6 million, have been raped during their lives. And of course, women of all races are targeted, but obviously some are more vulnerable than others. And here are some statistics for you on that. I'll just read a couple of them. 33.5% of multiracial women have been raped, as have 27% of American Indian and Alaska Native women, compared to 15% of Hispanic or Latino, 22% are African American, and 19% of white or Caucasian women. Most victims know their perpetrators. 51% of male victims were raped by a current or former intimate partner, and 41% were raped by an acquaintance. Stranger rape, in contrast, contrary to what most people think stereotypically about rape or sexual assault, accounts for only 14% of the total. Of men and boys, because of course, even though I will be saying mostly through this presentation, I'll be saying women raped, etc., we know that men and boys can be raped as well. 52% of men and boys report being raped by an acquaintance, and 15% by a stranger, so that pretty much parallels in terms of a stranger danger type rapes. Repeat victimization is common. Over 1/3 of women who were raped as minors were also raped as adults. I was staggered when I heard that statistic. The majority of perpetrators are male. 98% of female and 93% of male rape survivors report that their assailants were male. And of course, it should come as a surprise to no one that young people are especially at risk. And the title of the slide can be a little disturbing. This is not how we view our rape victims, some of our rape victims, but this is what society tends to call them disposable. Sex workers and substance abusers experience high rates of victimization. And certainly the public outcry is not the same when a victim is not in one of these categories. And that pretty much holds true across other types of crime as well. Quite frankly, if you're blonde and white and something happens to you, whether it's rape, murder, or whatever, the public outcry seems to be a whole lot stronger, and also media coverage, a whole lot stronger than when someone is not in that category. Very sadly, but true. Cases can be difficult to prove. There are often credibility problems for the victim. Of course, that's not unusual in other crimes as well, but we see it a lot in sexual assault. Transients, or not being able to find victims or eyewitnesses, can make it difficult to locate witness. Again, not just endemic to sexual assault, but it's something certainly that we have to deal with. And juror biases toward the likelihood of conviction. And I can point back to when I was an assistant prosecutor many years ago in this office before I went to the bench as a judge, that it was very, very difficult when I prosecuted sexual assault cases to gain convictions if I had a majority women on the jury or quite a few women on the jury. For some reason, and I'm pretty sure this holds true now, but I can say from personal experience of prosecuting many, many sexual assault cases, that I learned to kick off as many women on the jury as I could, frankly, pursuant to the number of preemptory challenges that I had. I would take a jury of all men any day at that time anyway to prosecute sexual assault. It's just the truth. It's disturbing, but that's just the truth. All right, I want to talk about one defendant. I'm going to fold in the reason why later I've chosen to start with this defendant. His name is Shelly Andre Brooks. It's a he, obviously. In August of 2001, the body of Sandra Davis, who was 53, was found beaten repeatedly in the head, sexually assaulted, and dragged into a closet where she was left to die. In January of 2002, the body of Pamela Greer, 33, was found in the same building in the same condition. A few months later, in April, the body of Marion Woods Daniels, age 36, was found sexually assaulted. Her head had been bludgeoned with a brick. Same month, body of Rhonda Miles, 45 years old, was found in a different vacant building, sexually assaulted and beaten with the leg of a chair. And in August, a few months even later, so that's 4 in 2002, a 19-year-old was raped, and she was released. Oh, here's a fifth one in 2002, I'm sorry. In November of 2002, the body of Thelma Johnson, 30 years old, was beaten to death and sexually assaulted. Well, the police hold, this is stating the obvious, but the police then, after the sixth body was found, hold a press conference warning of a serial killer. I mean, that probably should have been done much earlier. In October of 2005, the body of Melissa Tostin, 38, was found in a vacant garage, beaten with a cement object and sexually assaulted. June of the following year, the body of a woman that we were never able to identify, but she died by strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. And in July of 2006, a victim, we didn't use her name here, obviously, and we won't use the names of victims in this particular slide, this particular presentation, was raped and beaten into a coma, but she survived miraculously, and she identified the defendant, Shelly Andre Brooks. All of the murder victims had been black or African American, involved in prostitution, and had a history of drug abuse. Excuse me. And this is to show the point that women of different races can be at a higher degree of victimhood, and also depending on what their occupation is. Now later you will find that Shelly Andre Brooks, had a victim way before any of these murders happened, and that was one of the untested kits that was sitting on a shelf. And had that kit been properly and timely examined, then perhaps all of these women would still be alive. That's staggering. So we later convicted him of 5 counts for murdering 5 of these women and sexually assaulting 5 of these women, and sexually assaulting the woman that survived. And again, these women may be alive. He killed more than 5 women, but we were only able to prove that he killed 5 of them, and he was convicted. When sexual assaults are reported, the victim is routinely advised to have a sexual assault examination so a kit can be collected. Now, I'm going to talk about what happens after a sexual assault in many cases, but what I'm about to say doesn't refer to states or jurisdictions that have SANE or SAFE programs, forensic nurse examiners programs there. So this is what happens when you don't have such a program in existence. And thankfully here in Wayne County, where I'm the prosecutor, Wayne County is the largest of Michigan's 83 counties. We have a county system here, so they call us prosecutors and not DAs or state's attorneys, and although it's the same job. And so we are blessed to have a SANE, a forensic nurse programs, sexual assault nurse examiner for SANE. They are taken to, the victim goes to a hospital waiting room, which is a public place. Often there are very long waits, and the process can take up to, some of the waits can take up to 3 hours. The exams are done by untrained doctors or staff members. I'm talking about the rape kit exams. And also, oftentimes, the staff or the people dealing with the victim during this process of the rape kit examination are frequently not fluent in the preferred language. The victim must give a detailed statement. And prior to, if you can believe it, there was a law prior to now that the sexual assault victim had to pay for her own rape kit examination, which was ludicrous. And the law has changed, I'm assuming, in all states. I don't know that for a fact. But they're very expensive, and this was something that a victim had to do after and during a sexual assault, was pay for her own kit. But that's not the case anymore, thankfully. Rape kit collection, of course, contains head and pubic combing of the hair from the head and pubic areas, vaginal, oral, and rectal swabs, pulled hair samples from head and pubic area, like I just said. The clothing of the victim will be preserved for testing, so her clothes are taken away. And a forensic sexual assault examination can last from 4 to 10 hours, and is physically, as you can imagine, and emotionally draining. And remember, this is right after the victim has been sexually assaulted in the most intimate of ways. One forgotten kit is one forgotten victim too many. Ten forgotten kits is simply an outrage. Remember, each kit represents a victim or a potential victim. "100 forgotten kits is an abomination. 11,304 forgotten kits is a crisis beyond comprehension. And that was what was initially found in the Detroit Police Department, an annex to a property room that we didn't even know, we, prosecutors and others that have been in this business for a very long time, didn't even know that this particular property room existed. Now later you're going to see numbers that say 11,341, and the reason why you'll see that disparity is because the 11,304 is what was initially found, and some years later, in fact it was last year in 2013, when the Detroit Police Department had moved into their brand new police headquarters, that when they were moving the property room from the old the evidence from the old property room to the new property room, more rape kits, forgotten, untested, ignored, abandoned rape kits were found for a total of 11,341. It is estimated that there are about 400,000 kits that are estimated to be languishing in police storage in facilities around the country. 400,000. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Michigan Stadium. We call it the Big House. Michigan Stadium is the largest football stadium in the United States, including any professional football stadiums, any stadiums that the NFL plays in. So it's a college stadium, of course, University of Michigan, nicknamed the Big House, that seats over 100,000 people, the biggest one. And each of those 400,000 abandoned kits, each represents a victim, and that is enough victims to fill up University of Michigan's Big House 4 times. Astounding. There is Michigan Stadium. So it kind of gives you a good view of one filling up, but times that times 4, and that represents the number of untested, abandoned, backlog kits that exist in the United States today. Now, to go back to the beginning of this crisis here in Detroit, on August the 17th, I was sitting in my office, where I am now, and representatives from my office, I had sent one of my assistant prosecutors to go and take a tour or an inventory or an audit of all of the Detroit Police Department property rooms. We thought there was one, but they ended up being directed by the department to several different buildings, and this building you see here was one of them. And the Michigan State Police, just for a little bit of background in the history, the Michigan State Police the year before, in about August or September in 2008, took over all operations of the Detroit Police Department crime lab that we had here in the city because there were evidence issues with firearms. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but as a result of that, I asked the then police chief and the then mayor, that was 2 or 3 mayors ago and many chiefs of police ago, to close down the crime lab because there were quality control issues as well as issues with the firearms. And so as a result of that, the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, which handles all of the work for the state of Michigan, basically, took over all of the work from the city of Detroit and further overburdening them. And obviously, and rightfully so, they wanted to know what they had. They wanted to see what was in all these property rooms, which is why they were doing this audit. So they went to this warehouse at 5140 Riopelle Street in Detroit, not far from here. And during that tour, that is when my assistant prosecutor now, who is now the deputy chief of special victims here with elder abuse, child abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault, he recognized what he estimated to be 10,000 kits. These kits dated back to the 1980s, and we're talking about 2009. So after they were discovered, he called me, and like I said earlier, another 37 were found in 2013. The vast majority of these kits had never been submitted to either the Detroit Police Crime Lab, which is in operation at that point, up through 08, like I was saying a minute ago, or to the Michigan State Police Forensics Labs for DNA analysis. How did this happen? Of course, there's a kit and its ingredients. The kit is then turned over to the Detroit Police Department, or in some cases, the Detroit Police Department picks them up, and that is where it stopped. Now, these are victims that relied on the criminal justice system to take this evidence, if any could be gleaned from it, and hopefully use any results to find their perpetrator. Just stopped and languished for years. So ours was not really, it's called a backlog. Ours is not really a backlog. Excuse me, ours is worse than a backlog, because a backlog presupposes that the kits are there, someone's trying to test them, but it's being hampered for some reason, either resources or whatever, and they're just backed up. Ours were totally abandoned, ignored rape kits. I want to talk about another case to illustrate a point. Joshua Brooks. January 19th, 2004, the victim was going to see a drag show or some kind of a stage show with a girlfriend who I believe was getting married. Her girlfriend, for whatever reason, did not show up. And the victim, our victim, on January 19th, 2004, sat in her car and called her boyfriend, now husband, but her boyfriend at the time, as he was about to board a plane coming home from Spain. While on the phone talking to her boyfriend, a masked gunman appeared at her car window. Later, he was identified as Joshua Brooks. Much later, I'll get to that. He ordered her out of her car and told her to give up her money. He made her lie down on her back and patted her down. He made her roll over when she was on the ground and put a gloved hand in her vagina. He then made her get on her knees and he removed her tampon. And he forced our victim to perform fellatio and fled on foot. She immediately contacted the front door security of the club, and they contacted the police. The police responded and noted the following: footprints in the snow around the victim's car, the used tampon that had been pulled out near her car. The victim's clothing was wet, where she had to lie, and oh yeah, there was snow on the ground. She had to lie and kneel in the snow. She was taken to the sex crimes unit of the Detroit Police Department. At that time, they did not have the SANE nurses, I don't believe. But the victim was taken to the hospital for a sexual assault kit. And then that particular sexual assault kit was one of the 11,341 sitting on the shelf, and it remained untested. Remember, this happened on January 19th of 2004. Remained untested for all those years, until 2013, when it was analyzed. Between the time of 2004 and 2013, Joshua Brooks had gone on to commit a home invasion, assault with intent to murder, in May of 2004. This is after the rape of our victim. And since he was a juvenile at the time, he was committed as a ward of the state, which is the most severe thing that can happen to a juvenile here in Michigan that's not tried as an adult. He committed an assault with intent to murder, an assault with intent to commit armed robbery in 2009. And at that point, he was sentenced to 4.5 to 20 years in prison. Again, this is after the rape of our victim and after the rape kit was taken, but before 2013 when it was discovered on the shelf. 2013 when it was tested. He was scheduled to be released, literally scheduled to be released from his prison sentence, from his armed robbery in 2009, when we charged him with our NIJ sexual assault case, National Institute of Justice, and I'll talk more about that later, and sexual assault case, and was sentenced to 12 to 30 years in prison. So those are the things that could have been prevented if, in fact, these had been tested on time. So on September, remember these kits were found by my assistant on August 17th, 2009. And between August 17th and September 8th, I tried to engage the then police chief, Warren Evans, to help me we needed to figure out what we should do about this horrible situation that over 11,000 of our victims over the years found themselves in, and we found ourselves in as a result of this discovery. I wasn't certainly going to ignore it, not for a second, but during those couple of weeks, I tried to engage him with phone calls first, and it was very bluntly told me that it wasn't on his watch. And I said, well, it wasn't on mine either. That doesn't matter. The law doesn't say we only prosecute cases that happened on our watch. We are responsible when we take our oaths of office for our various positions to perform the whole scope of our duties. And he said, well, I'll do an independent investigation. Well, I said, that is totally insufficient. First of all, there needs to be an investigation, but it shouldn't be conducted by you. And what are we going to do about these victims? So getting nowhere with the chief of police. See, I thought that once these kids were discovered, it would be a no-brainer that we needed to do something. In fact, the day that I found out back in August of '09, I went home and Googled 10,000 rape kits. I had no idea that it was a national problem. I thought, here again, here's another Detroit-only problem. And to my surprise and shock, frankly, and not much shocks me after being in this business for years, I found that this was a national issue. So by September 8th, I had it with this chief. I had it. And I wrote him a very, very terse letter raising concerns over their inaction to even talk about these recently discovered sexual assault kits. Well, the next thing says that my letter launched a massive effort to determine how thousands of rape kits could be ignored over the course of more than 25 years, now more than 30 years. But what happened was, after I sent this letter, the next day in the paper, I believe it was next couple of days, my letter appeared in the Detroit Free Press. Now, everybody thought at first that I leaked it, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't have done that eventually, but someone from the Detroit Police Department leaked that letter, and the reason why we knew that is because there was a stamp received by the Detroit Police Department on the second page. Somebody within Police Chief Evans' office realized that nothing was going to be done by this chief, and so that was their course of action. I still to this day don't know who it was, but I think that person, because everything blew up. It was on the front page of the paper. Everybody all of a sudden became concerned. The public was outraged, and that's when we tried to formulate some plans about what we were going to do, because there was no blueprint or path for, even though this had happened in most of the states in the Union, there was really no roadmap or blueprint as to what should happen next. I just knew that as the elected prosecutor here in Wayne County, that there was no way that we needed to test all these kits. We needed to try to find justice for all these victims. I didn't know how I was going to get there at the time, but I knew that was my first course of action. So then we applied for a grant for, it's an Action Research Project grant, and it was from the National Institute of Justice, and thank God for them, because this grant that we did receive, as you'll see in a minute, along with Houston, we were the only two collaboratives, because the grant, one of the ways that we got it was we were supposed to form a collaborative with all the stakeholders to be able to apply and have all the stakeholders agree that they would work together in it. And so we got the collaborative together. We ended up calling it a collaborative community partnership to study all of these kits. And in April of 2011, we were one of, as I said a minute ago, one of 2 jurisdictions in the country to receive this grant. It was a 30-month award in the amount of $1.5 million. We received a little bit more later on, and it was from the National Institute of Justice, which is an arm of the Department of Justice, to determine the scope of the problem of unsubmitted sexual assault kits and the resources to address the problem. So basically, we had 2 missions. One of the primary goals or missions was to produce transportable lessons. In other words, to produce a protocol and strategies to help other jurisdictions that discover these kits in their communities. So to do a national protocol through this Action Research Project, that anybody who has this issue will have a roadmap or that blueprint that I didn't have. And actually, the grant ended on September the 30th of last year, 2013. And the report from our researcher should be unveiled any day now. We're expecting it any day now. The project was called, excuse me, the National Institute of Justice Sexual Assault Action Research Project. And this project, as I said, started in April of 2011 and ran through September of 2013, as I said before. As I said, our primary goal was, one of our goals was to examine why this happened and to examine, and this is very important, the culture of victim blaming and disbelief that discouraged victims from filing police reports and resulted in cases being closed with little or no investigation. We found all kinds of evidence later on that in many of these files that took a gargantuan effort to find, the police felt free to write notes in the files that said that discouraged victims from prosecuting. So we had those two main goals that we had, and I should tell you that even before, as we were applying for this particular grant, we started working. One of the first things we did, we started working on a database because there was no nexus between all the over 11,000 rape kits were found in any police reports or files. Nothing that connected the two. Nothing was computerized. So we literally, it took us 9 months to go through each and every kit of the over 11,000, the 11,341, well, at that time 304 kits, and try to put a database together. So what we did is from the outside information that was on the kit, we pulled the name of the victim, where it happened, and any other identifying information or any information about that particular rape kit. We started making our database, and then we had to go and try to find the files that were associated with these kits, the police files that were associated with these kits. It was not an easy task, very, very difficult. And remember, at this time, we still had a police department that was relatively uncooperative, even though they had agreed to sign on to the Action Research Project. We, of course, couldn't have done it without them. And we at times, we didn't find very many files at first. We at times had to go back because, remember, some of these kids go back 25, now 30 years. When they didn't have files, they were literally putting using those old ledger books where we were literally blowing off dust off of these books that they brought us and trying to read the yellowed out ink to try to link these rape kits to the police reports. I want to tell you now about Billy Bingham. Billy Bingham was, in July of 2005, he was 12 years old, and he was pumping gas at a gas station near his house to make money, asking people, can I pump your gas for whatever. Eventually, the defendant came up to him and offered him a chance to do odd jobs at his house for cash. Well, you know what's coming next, unfortunately. Our victim got into the defendant's later identified Billy Bingham's van and went to his house. At the house, Bingham sodomized him and forced him to perform fellatio and performed fellatio on him, 12 years old. He tied our victim up and left him in the house while he drove his other children that were in the house at the time to their mother's house, to their various mother's house, their various baby mama's houses. He returned and took the boy back to his van and dumped him in the street about a block from his house. Our 12-year-old victim immediately reported the assault to his mother, who then called the police right away. He was taken to the hospital for a sexual assault kit. Now, we don't do many sexual assault kits on children, but we have in our over 11,000 kits, I believe about 10 or 12, where, in fact, the victim was the child victim was given a sexual assault kit. The child had, at the time, visible, these are not the actual marks, these are just a picture depicting what the child looked like. He had visual ligature marks on his arms. He also pointed out the house to the police where he had been assaulted. The police and hospital personnel, as I said a minute ago, noted rope burns on his wrist, cut lip, and also noted an anal discharge. The The police did nothing, closed out the case. 5 months later, Protective Services investigated when he, the victim, the 12-year-old, told one of his teachers about the assault. She, of course, followed the protocol of the Child Protection Act and notified the Department of Social Services, and they, in turn, called the police. I sent a report to the police, I'm sorry. He was the defendant, Billy Bingham, we found out later. And again, nothing was done. In 2013, this victim's rape kit was one of the ones that was found on the shelf and was analyzed, and the CODIS hit came back to a sexual offender. He was already a registered sex offender at that address that the victim had pointed out to the police in 2005. Had they done a bare minimum of that investigation, they would have found that out. And all kinds of corroborating evidence in this particular case. Now, he was a registered sex offender because he had previously served a prison sentence for raping a 5-year-old child. The victim at all times was more than willing to cooperate. When we contacted him back in last year, he related he told our investigators here and the prosecutor that tried this case that he still experienced trauma every time he drove past the house, because he was now 22. The victim was 12 at the time in 2005, was 22 years old when we contacted him in 2013, and he had a 1-year-old son, and he agreed to come forward because he said he did not want anything like this happening to his son that he had now. And his mother also reported that her child would experience trauma every time he was driven past his house. We tried him for this case, and he's now serving I'm happy to report that he was sentenced in September of last year to 40 to 80 years in prison, which could have happened years ago. We could have spared everything else that occurred here. Here's some additional reasons why the kits were not tested that we were able to glean. And again, I should stop here and pause for a minute and say that I had to, despite every instinct in my body wanting me to, I had to stop any discussion of victim blaming, why this was there, why the police didn't care about this. And that didn't get us anywhere, so we had to lay that aside and just work together as a collaborative. I should tell you also that now the current police chief that we have, James Craig, was not the police chief at the time, and when he came in, he's been our police chief for less than a year now. There's been 6 police chiefs since I've been the prosecutor since '04. And Chief Craig came in on July 1st, my 16-year-old daughter's birthday of last year. And he owned this immediately and has been extremely cooperative with us proceeding. So there was never a formal policy and protocol for testing previously. Of course, staffing levels was always an issue. High turnover in law enforcement leadership. There have been 5 or 6 chiefs in the last 5 years since the kits were discovered. And these are aside from any feeling of incompetence or whatever. A lack of professional training for law enforcement. In Michigan, we have an arm of our Department of Social Services, Department of Human Services, used to be called the Department of Social Services, that is called the Michigan Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention and Treatment Board. And its executive director is a woman named Debbie Kane, who has a wealth of knowledge on this issue. And she now offers, or her organization now offers free training in this area for law enforcement, so there can be no excuse at this point for not having professional training on this issue. Another issue that arose for us very soon, near the very beginning, was when should a victim be notified? And that's why when we put our collaborative together, we think this is one of the reasons why we were one of 2 jurisdictions to receive the NIJ grant, because we knew very quickly that besides from having the prosecutor's office, the crime lab, the Michigan State University where our researcher was, the Detroit Police Department, and other people in the collaborative, and also we had the grant called for a private nonprofit to be a part of the collaborative, and that was Joyful Heart Mariska Hargitay's foundation that she has, Mariska Hargitay, who is the star of Law and Order SVU, and that's how we became involved with her, but that's another story. We noticed very quickly that we had to have the victim advocates involved, because even though as prosecutors we believe that we have the ability to deal with victims, and we deal with victims very well, we knew that we needed to have experts in our collaborative that deal with victims on a regular basis every day, that have the expertise that prosecutors don't, even though we work with them all the time, because we would be knocking on doors of victims that, 10 years later, 20 years later, 25 years later, that had been raped, whose kit we just discovered, that maybe is remarried and has a whole new life and hadn't told their new husband, for example, or any of their family that they were raped in the first place. So we knew we had to approach this very gingerly. And so we discussed this a lot, victim notification issues, and continue to discuss victim notification issues throughout our whole process, and still now, today. So when should a victim be notified? Before testing? When the DNA reveals a match? Should we notify the victims that even their kit was found? And ultimately, we decided, no, we would not notify the victim when the kit was found, because what if we submit that kit and there's not enough DNA to come with a profile? Then we've contacted this victim all these years later, and we don't have any information for her. And so now we ended up making sure that once we've received a CODIS hit, or when the DNA reveals a match, that's when we notify our victim and get to work toward investigating and prosecuting these cases, because most of these cases have never been investigated before. We also talked about how the victim should be notified. Should it be by letter, phone call, in person? And we ultimately decided it should be in person. So the possible approaches, or the possible choices that I had, and my office had when this was discovered, were to do nothing, worry about only the new cases. Absolutely not. That was not an approach we were going to take. Test only kits from cases that can be prosecuted. No, that's not what we decided either. And test all kits for research purposes only. In other words, what some other jurisdictions have done, test all kits for research purposes only with no eye on investigating and prosecuting. And my view was always test all kits and investigate all kits as cases for prosecution, including the use of older cases to show pattern and identity. And what that means is, as you can imagine, we had a huge problem with some of these cases with statute of limitation problems. And so there were people who felt that those cases, why test those, because those cases can't be prosecuted because the statute of limitation has been exhausted. But here in Michigan, and I know in most states, in all states across the union, and certainly in the federal statutes as well, here in Michigan it's called Rule 404B. And in Rule 404B, we have to be able to convince a judge that we are using victims from cases where the statute of limitations has been exhausted, using them to testify in other cases where the evidence shows it's the same person, because we can show pattern identity and scheme, plan, et cetera. So again, it's a rigorous hurdle that we have to go over, but we can use the results in cases that have reached the statute of limitation in other ways, and that's why we want them all tested. So, excuse me. I should mention here that I think it's post-2000, the year 2000, the Michigan legislature changed the law, and there now is no statute of limitations on criminal sexual conduct, that's our rape statute, remember, in the first degree. There still is a statute of limitation for second degree, third degree, and fourth degree. Fourth degree is a misdemeanor, but more concerned with second and third. And so, but you don't know, or a police officer or an investigator who brings us a case, or even a prosecutor doesn't know immediately whether it's going to be first degree or not. So, you know, it could be, that's why we needed to make sure we investigated all kits. Talk about Reginald Holland. And this serves to show a statute of limitations issue defendant. On March 20th of 2002, Reginald Holland pled guilty to attempt breaking and entering, and a DNA sample was ordered. Now, I think in most states, but certainly here in Michigan, when a defendant is convicted of a crime and is sentenced to the Michigan Department of Correction, he has to give up his DNA. So as a result of him being pled guilty to attempt breaking and entering, the sample was ordered. It's not just for defendants who are in prison, it's for all defendants who are convicted of certain crimes. Now, we're going to go backwards. So this will make sense. This is a little confusing. We're going to go backwards, and this will make sense as we go along. So the DNA sample was available. in 3/20/02. Let's skip ahead to January 29th of 2012. The defendant sexually assaulted victim number 4, and I'll tell you how we know. And so when that kit was tested, our project identified 3 other victims that he had sexually assaulted. Now, so what happened was his DNA was put into the system, so his DNA sample was put into CODIS. So it was in CODIS in 02. When we started doing our project, and there was a CODIS hit for Reginald Holland because his sample of DNA was in the system, 3 times it hit. October of 2005, when the sexually assaulted victim number 1, June of 09, when he sexually assaulted victim number 2, and October of 09, when he sexually assaulted victim number 3. So those were rape kits that were on the shelf. Excuse me. And remember, because we had the hit because we had his DNA in 02. So it wasn't until January 29th of 2012 when he sexually assaulted victim number 4. And on the 22nd of January of 2014, the defendant was found guilty of something else, of assaulting victim number 4, and victims 1 and 2 testified at that trial because those kits had been now tested, and we were able to use the testimony of those 2 women in the trial on the 22nd of January of this year to convict him. So legally able to use that. So again, we had his DNA 02, and the NIJ project, which paid for the testing of 1,600 kits. So 1,600 kits were tested from April 11th of April of 2011 through September 30th of 2013. And 3 of the hits that we received were from the rape kits of, again, October 05, June 09, October 09. And so then, since we had that hit, we were able to pull the victims from October of 05 and June of 09 to testify at the trial of a new victim that had been sexually assaulted in 2012. If the 05 kit had been tested, victim number 1's kit had been tested appropriately and timely, the other rapes may have been prevented. Now, rapists assault between 7 and 11 victims on average. The offenders tend to have a very lengthy offending careers, beginning usually in adolescence and spanning decades. By the time they are caught, if the rapists are ever apprehended, they often have victimized many, many people. So let's to that point, let's talk about Gabriel Cooper. We call this the cost of lost opportunities. So we have at the top there, you see, just above the red line, of October 14th of 2001, where Gabriel Cooper was convicted of fleeing and eluding, basically running from the police, a police car that wanted to pull him over. And he received 2 years of probation. Now, look at the red line. In June, the 4th day of 02, he committed a sexual assault, and it was not tested. That was a victim that was raped outside of a store in Detroit. Now, he goes on now. Now, remember, that red line is significant because had the kit been tested timely, perhaps all of the crime that happened under that red line may not have happened. And look how shocking it is as you go down. In 03, in March, receiving and stealing stolen property. Basically, probably driving a stolen car, but receiving and concealing stolen property. He received another 2 years probation. And in September of 03, another did the same thing again, and that's when the judge finally sent him to prison, 10 months to 5 years. So Gabriel Cooper's DNA went into CODIS as a result of being convicted. So, again, November 30th of 04, fleeing and eluding, he received another sentence of 14 months to 10 years. And then in November of 04, receiving concealed and stolen property, again, received 1 to 5 years. So you can see if you look at the September 4th, he got out in less than, well, do the math, I guess it's for a little over a year. And he back on the street to commit more crime, that's there in yellow. And then in 2005, he committed a capital offense, so assault with intent to murder. That case was dismissed. But did he stop? In August of 06, another receiving concealed and stolen property received 1 to 5. And then in 08, in December, another receiving concealment again received another prison sentence of a year and a half to 5 years. And then this is when the raping starts. 2011, he rapes, remember I told you criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, that's our CSC, is our rape statute in Michigan. Rapes someone, rapes our victim, kidnaps them, and that case was dismissed. I don't know why at this point why it was dismissed. Then look at what he did in the next 4 cases. Rapes another 4 victims, kidnaps in the first 2, and in the second 2, RA stands for armed robbery, FA stands for felonious assault, and FF stands for felony firearm, which means he had a gun when he did that. So his DNA had been in the system since 04, and look what happens when nothing happens. If this kid had been tested and put in the system, then when his DNA was put into the system in 04, there would have been a hit, and he could have been dealt with appropriately. But he goes on to rape 4 of the 5 cases we can prove, and you see his prison sentences there that he received. Look at how many more victims and how many more crimes he went on to commit. So what we say here is if you think testing kits is expensive, and when we first started, the quotes that we were getting, that we were paying, is anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 per kit. Think about how much it costs to lose the opportunity to prevent all these crimes from happening. A whole lot more than $1,200. Prison costs, prosecution costs, paying jurors, making the victims go through this. So some of the costs are monetary and some aren't. Astounding. Now, let's talk about how these 1,600 kits were analyzed. And again, we had enough funds to get 1,600 of the over 11,000 analyzed. And this was in addition to the 400 kits that were tested with funding provided by the Office of Violence Against Women. Now, that was a pilot project that was done first. And we call that Project 400, where statisticians from Michigan State University told us that if we did a random sampling of 400 kits, that would give us a snapshot, an idea of what we were looking at in the over 11,000 kits, so we could start somewhere. And so we had done that earlier, that pilot program, and we contacted those victims, and that work still continues today, although it's separate from the NIJ grant. So altogether, we've had over 2,000 tested, but we're talking right now, to be clear, of the 1,600 from the NIJ grant. Now, in June 2013, last year, Governor Rick Snyder and Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and Attorney General for Michigan Bill Schuette announced that $4 million of money obtained in an unrelated federal settlement would be allocated to analyze 8,000 of the remaining untested kits. That money didn't come to my office. It went right to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, and the work on those kits are being done as we speak. There were 2 private labs that were contracted with that each got 4,000 kits apiece, and the testing rate for testing these kits was severely reduced because they had the bulk. They had the bulk work to do. I think they're paying $500 per kit or something now. So we're in the position now where most of the kits are going to be paid for to be tested. But it's not simply enough to test the kits, as I've said a couple of times before. What justice does that bring anybody? It doesn't bring anybody any justice. Cases must be investigated, often for the first time. Charges must be brought if they can be brought. Cases must be prosecuted if they can be prosecuted. And I should tell you now that we were first told from our Project 400 that there will be anywhere from 1,100 to 1,700 prosecutable cases that we'd be able to prosecute from this number. However, we started getting hits back at an alarming rate, and we now project that we are going to get over 3,000 prosecutable cases from the analysis. And let's look at that analysis. So in 2013, our office partnered with the Detroit Crime Commission, a nonprofit, and we formed the Sexual Assault Free Detroit Initiative, SAFE-D. The mission of SAFE-D is to raise awareness of the funds sufficient to test all remaining kits and ensure that every case is investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And there's their logo there. Further, last year, we learned that this is in addition to the money from NIJ. We had awarded another grant, almost $1 million over 3 years, to support a cold case sexual assault unit. The reason why that was done, and then we'll get to the stats, I hope, is because we were finding that our new rape victims were being, justice was being denied because we were working on the rape kit cases. And so then now everybody is being denied justice. And so what's really needed is a two-pronged system, a special unit to deal with just the cold cases or the rape kit cases, and a special unit to deal with, within the sexual assault unit, to deal with the new cases, so our victims are not further victimized. We're pursuing funding for our cold case unit to investigate and prosecute the cases that will come from the $4 million from that testing. And it's projected that it's going to cost $2 million a year for 5 years, so a total amount of $10 million. Now, I should tell you here that the County of Wayne, my funding source, has not paid a single dime, penny, nickel, quarter toward this effort, even though, being the chief law enforcement officer of the County of Wayne, the last time I checked, sexual assault against women was a crime that I am obligated by the state constitution and a mandatory function that I have to prosecute these cases, but yet our CEO of Wayne County, Robert Ficano, does not believe this is a priority, and as a matter of fact, recently put this in writing. And since the county is in such a deficit that he's run into the ground over the last 10 years, now the governor of the state has asked him for deficit elimination plans, and on the plan concerning the prosecuting attorney's office, my office, he says that Prosecutor Kym Worthy must stop prosecuting low-priority items. Number one on that list was stop prosecuting cases emanating from these rape kits and cases of sexual assault. In writing that that's a low priority that I should not be doing unless outside funding is obtained. Outrageous. And that just gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here in Detroit with how our CEO, I shouldn't say Detroit, Wayne County is part of Detroit, obviously, or the other way around, Detroit is part of Wayne County, but this is what we have to deal with. So I have to go around the state at this point and raise money to prosecute rape kits and to prosecute sexual assault. And remember, sexual assault, it's not just sexual assault, it's people rape and then they break into your house and they rape and then they kill, they carjack you and then rape. So it's really talking about all crime. We're also initiating legislation changes to ensure that no kit remains untested in the state of Michigan, that all kits tested are going forward, and that all kits are electronically tracked. Now, if in fact you can track a package that you order off of Amazon.com and you can go online and see where that package is, then we ought to be able to track a rape kit through the criminal justice system, and we're working on that right now. I want to just give you a few highlights of what we're trying to do in the legislature. We want timely DNA analysis of rape kit evidence, and we call our bill, which has been introduced now, we have a number of sponsors in the Michigan legislature. Sexual Assault Kit Submission Act is what we call it. It's a collaborative process between prosecution, law enforcement, healthcare organizations, and we would include the SANE nurses there, and victims organizations, of course. And we crafted legislation to be introduced. It was introduced in March to address the process for rape kits prospectively. In other words, we're not looking right now at legislation for rape kits going backwards. We'll get to that. But right now we're going forward to make sure we don't have this problem in the future. And it provides greater victim input into kit testing, prescribes the process and timeliness for kit pickup by law enforcement and testing by the lab, and establishes boundaries under which the DNA profile can be removed from CODIS. So we are going to, later this year, introduce legislation, or write legislation to be introduced to address the rape kit backlog or untested kits, establish a tracking mechanism that I just spoke about a minute ago, establish a funding mechanism for that tracking and for the other things that need to be done, and establish victim notification processes. And the ultimate goal is to identify and apprehend these offenders as soon as possible to stop serial rapists. So when Mariska, I think I mentioned earlier that we partnered with Joyful Heart, and that's Mariska Hargitay's charity. And they've been very instrumental in helping us raise funds. And she came here about approximately 2 months ago, on March 9th and March 10th, personally to help us with this effort. On March 9th, we had an event at a local restaurant where we invited people, movers and shakers, so to speak, for lack of a better word, in Detroit, to get them to network with their friends to help us raise money. And then the next day, in the morning, she attended and spoke along with me at a legislative breakfast, and that's where we laid out the legislation that I just laid out for you. And we had a very high turnout from Michigan legislators, which I think is helping the bill as it goes through the system now. So I mentioned earlier that 1,600 kits were identified to be part of the project through the NIJ. And, of course, the crime lab outsourced the kits to a private lab for testing. And remember, this is before the $40 million became available. This is a part of the NIJ grant. And Marshall University also did some testing as well. Now, remember, we're talking about 1,600 kits, not the 400 from Project 400, and not the whole over 11,000. We still have much work to do on that. Remember, 4,000 has gone to two separate labs. This is just from 1,600 kits. So this is astounding statistics you're getting ready to see. So just 1,600 kits out of the over 11,000 we're talking about right now. We had 785 CODIS eligible profiles that were done. 49% of all kits. That's an astounding number. There have been 339 offender hits, meaning that the profile matched the profile of a known offender that was already in CODIS. When I say CODIS eligible, I mean that the scientists were able to have enough DNA to form a profile. There have been 27 case-to-case or forensic hits, meaning that the profile matched the profile of an unidentified offender listed in CODIS for another offense. So a crime happened, they don't know who the person is, but the evidence has been entered into CODIS, and so we have hits from that as well. There have been 89 offender and forensic hits, meaning that the profile matched an offender in CODIS who has committed multiple sexual assault crimes. 89. There have been 51 twins, and what that means, and I'll take a minute here to explain this because it's astounding. I should probably find another word. So 59 twin hits, and that means hits to another of the original batch. What that means is, looking at the 1,600, 51 times within that 1,600 we had hits to each other just within that 1,600. And 9 times we had hits to 2 other in our original batch of 1,600. Imagine the odds. So 51 twin hits, which means 51 times hit to another DNA profile within the 1,600 that we had, and 9 times 2 other times. Statisticians have never seen anything like this. And we have identified 127 serial rapists just from the over 1,600. Now, oftentimes when I talk about this, I've told you now that this is not a Detroit-only problem, and that's somehow how things, when you have a major urban area in a state, they say, oh, all the crime happens in Detroit, blah, blah, blah. The national media sometimes portray us that way, and it's just not true. But when I talked to legislators on March the 10th when Mariska was there, and when I talk just going around the country now, talking about this, excuse me, we learned that rapists don't stop at the city limits, or as people like to say, 8 Mile Road. That's not the, everybody thinks that if you cross 8 Mile Road, that's the city limit. Of course, there are many city limits on all sides, but they don't just stop at the Detroit city limits. They don't stop at the next county over. They don't stop at that state. Look at this. The CODIS hits from our project, and just the 1,600, have hit to other assaults in all of these other states. Now, if you look just ahead, if you looked at Texas and look to the right of Texas, there's Louisiana, and look above Louisiana, that's Arkansas, and that Arkansas should also be red. So this is 22 other states besides Michigan, so 23 states and the District of Columbia, 24 jurisdictions. There are hits that emanate from the 1,600 kits that we have tested. So these defendants, these rapists have gone on to rape in almost half of the United States. Almost half of the states in the United States. Imagine what we're going to see when we finish testing all of these kits. So there have been hits in, like I said, 23 jurisdictions besides Michigan. So 22 states and Michigan plus the District of Columbia. Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, Missouri, Louisiana, Oregon, California, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Maryland, Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Alaska, New Mexico, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, and Indiana. Absolutely unbelievable. Like I said earlier, if all the kits are tested and the testing continues to yield the same amount of CODIS hits, we can expect to generate almost 3,000, and they're now saying 3,000 or more, cases that will require investigation and prosecution. There will be an additional, that's in addition to the 300 to 350, that's a very low number, probably closer to 500, new cases, excuse me, that are reviewed annually by the 6 members of our sexual assault team. That's the new cases. And that was a new case, new unit, old unit idea that I was talking about earlier. As of April 17th, 2014, investigations have been initiated on 50 CODIS hits. Warrants have been issued on 13 cases. This is a little higher now. Convictions established on 10, and the remainder are pending. That may seem low, but remember everything we had to do to even get to this point. And this is the kicker. And many of these files that we examined from Detroit Police Department when we finally found them, you know, a lot of them, the majority of them to the letter said that victims could not be located. Now, some of these cases go back, like I said, 30 years, and we have located all but one victim. All but one victim has been located by my investigators. Let's talk about Eric Wilkes. In January of 2012, he approached our victim in a liquor store and offered to sell her drugs, sexually assaulted her. After the rape, she followed him and identified him. His DNA matched the following crime reports. Look at this. June 21st of 06, where he claimed to be an undercover officer to get a deaf victim, a non-hearing victim, into his car, and he raped her. May 2011, a victim was found dead in an alley, nude from the waist down with trauma to her face and raped. August 14th, 2011, a victim was grabbed by Eric Wilkes by her bicep and threatened with a gun. He raped her. August of 2011, again the 25th, about 11 days later, he pulled up in a car and forced a victim into a car at gunpoint and raped her. December 13th, 2011, the assailant Eric Wilkes approached a victim coming out of the gas station and told her that her friend had died and he raped her. So, let's just go back to that for a minute. All of these possibly could have been prevented. What is necessary to successfully prosecute cold case or cold sexual assault cases? All kits must be tested. There has to be a cold case unit, a dedicated unit of some kind to pay attention to these cases. Must be investigators, advocates, prosecutors, and it must be victim-centered. Now, research has shown that once a victim is mistreated by a police department, they really don't want the same agency to investigate them. So our office is doing that. We've been funded to do that, and we'll continue to do that on a number of these cases. It has to be victim-centered, obviously. Victim-centered, not centered on the, not what the victim needs and wants. Trauma-informed. SANE and SAFE programs help that quite a bit. And offender-focused, not focused on the victim and her, on her life. But it has to be a focus on the offender, the one that did the offending. Cold case investigators. Victim interactions with police are often negative during the initial assault, during the assault. Rape victims are often actively discouraged by police to make a report and told by police personnel that what happened to them isn't serious enough to pursue. They're blamed, culture of victim blaming I talked about earlier, are often accused of false reporting. They report high levels of dissatisfaction with their interactions with police and frequently note that the police were cold, insensitive, and lacked compassion or concern for their well-being. This is why we were initially funded, remember, by NIJ to look at this culture of victim blaming and get to the bottom of that. Try to get to the bottom of that. To date, research has not yet identified successful programs for changing law enforcement response to sexual assault. Advocates. There's a serious psychological fallout from sexual assault and law enforcement interaction. Advocates, of course, provide that support and information. Community-based advocates help maintain a victim-centered approach to case management. Prosecutors. Emerging research suggests that specialized prosecution units are a very effective strategy for engaging victims in the criminal justice system and supporting their recoveries. Units are staffed with prosecutors with expertise and interest. Remember, you want prosecutors that not only are expert enough to do it, but are interested in doing this work. Not everybody wants to do it, in working exclusively or nearly exclusively on sexual assault cases. The benefits of cold case units. The prosecutors develop a better understanding of community and legal resources available to victims and are better able to link survivors to specific services. Allow the victims to become more comfortable with the process so they do not have to tell their story repeatedly to other prosecutors. It's the same prosecutor. And have the opportunity to develop trust and rapport with their prosecutor, which makes, our conviction rates go up many times. And too few studies draw conclusions about the impact of these case outcomes and prosecution rates. Our general lessons learned from our pilot project on victim notification protocol. When victim-centered trauma-informed protocol is used, the outline that I provided earlier, most victims do not have strong negative reactions to being contacted. They just don't. That's contrary to what a lot of people think or may think. Most victims do decide to have continued contact with the criminal justice system, and that's what we found. More research needs to be done, especially with victims aged 16 to 24 at the time of the assault, victims of crime that occurred 9 years ago, and victims of known offenders, because those are the groups that tend to be less likely to go forward. We all have to work together to deal with this issue. And if anyone has any further questions about this, I can always be contacted. Mary Morrow from my office can be contacted at 313-224-7270, 313-224. She is the executive director of this project and can be very helpful, and she's also the one working on the legislation. I thank you so much for listening to me talk about this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Kym. I think this is going to be very, very helpful to many communities across the country that are dealing with these issues right now. So this was amazing, an amazing webinar. We did record it. It will be available on our website. So we hope that many more people will be able to take advantage of listening to your experience and what you all have been able to do in Wayne County. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and please remember to check out our DNA Resource Center at victimsofcrime.org/DNA. And all of our archived webinars are there and resources. We hope that you all have a great afternoon and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.